Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Kerr-Tar Regional Council of Governments and Rural Planning Organization for this webinar on local rural funding opportunities through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was passed by Congress in November of last year. I'm Sam Boswell, the RPO Coordinator and Transportation Planner for the Kerr-Tar region. I will introduce our speaker today, and then I'll help facilitate any questions that any of the attendees may have following the presentation. So we encourage you to use the chat or the question and answer feature to submit any questions that come up during Mr. Hiemstra's presentation. As you may have heard me say just a second ago, yes, the presentation will be available. We'll be sending that out to everybody who registered following the webinar. So now let me introduce Mr. Hiemstra. Hal Hiemstra has more than 30 years of experience in government affairs. He currently represents a wide range of public and private sector clients on issues involving transportation, economic development, infrastructure, and community health and safety, and that's just to name a few. He has specialized knowledge in federal transportation policy and understands how transportation investments can make communities more livable and sustainable. Prior to becoming a founding partner with Summit Strategies, where he now works, Mr. Hiemstra spent many years as a non-attorney partner at Ball Janik LLP, was the Vice President for National Policy at the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and VP for Policy at Scenic America, and directed the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture Research Foundation. He's also served as a consultant to the Carter administration's National Agriculture Land Study, and in 1991 was appointed to the National Scenic Byways Commission by President George H.W. Bush. Mr. Hiemstra has worked on every national surface transportation reauthorization since ICE-T in 1991, and has served as a political and policy advisor to Transportation for America, and has presented before NATO's Transportation and Policy Conferences. Hopefully this background gives you an idea of how fortunate we are to have Mr. Hiemstra with us today. And with that, Hal, I will turn it over to you, and I will pull up the presentation, but we thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thanks, Sam, and it's a pleasure to be here. With reading all of that introduction, I'm afraid we're out of time. So I appreciate that. I didn't really expect that you would go through all of that, but it's interesting to think about how long I have been working on transportation and transportation infrastructure, and working with local communities. I work with local communities all over the country. Our firm is, I'm based in Washington, D.C., but our firm is actually founded and based in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon. And so I work with a lot of rural communities in Oregon and Washington, but we also work around the country. We work with rural communities in California and elsewhere around the country. At one point, I actually used to represent the city of Asheville, North Carolina. So I have a little bit of connection to North Carolina, but that was a while ago. Today, I'm going to focus on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which the administration now is also starting to call the BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I wish they had called it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law from the beginning, because it's a lot easier to say than the IIJA. But a lot of folks, I noticed when I was at the NATO conference the last several days, folks are still calling it the IIJA because that's what it was passed as last November. And so I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, the IIJA and the bill. My presentation is, I'm a policy guy. And so I don't really do PowerPoints very well, which you will see. And I put way too much information on every slide. And I am not going to bore you by just reading through 20 slides, but the information that is on all of my slides is actually quite detailed and quite, it will be a good reference to look back at after this presentation. And as Sam said, we're making copies available to everyone who wants it. So happy to share that. And I will just try to really highlight different elements of individual slides as we move forward. So Sam, if you could advance to the next slide, that'd be great. So I'm sure that most of you have read in your local press or in summaries of the IIJA, the bill, over the last several months, that it was a $1.2 trillion bill. And you've also probably seen references to a $550 billion bill, and both of those are correct. The 1.2 was the total amount of funding that was in the IIJA, but out of that 1.2, only 550 billion was new money. The rest was just reauthorization of the surface transportation bill. And the surface transportation bill, Congress reauthorizes it typically every 5 or 6 years. And so a significant portion of that 1.2 was actually just reauthorization, and it will roll out over the next 5 years, as well most of the 550 billion. It doesn't become available immediately. The 550 billion, as the slide shows on the right side, it is about 110 billion for roads. It has about 105 billion for rail and transit. There's 25 billion for airports, and then there's water infrastructure and a variety of other cats and dogs, but which I'll go through a little bit as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. This is just a similar slide to the one that I just went through. I just draw your attention to the new funding on the right-hand side of the slide. And that just really breaks down a little bit more on how each of the different categories of surface transportation, infrastructure, and aviation gets split up. And then there's also a fair amount of funding for utilities, and that is utilities broadly defined, because power infrastructure, for instance, is 65 billion, broadband is 65 billion, water infrastructure is 55 billion. And those will all be distributed, some by formula, some by grant, discretionary grant funding, and by different agencies that are actually outlined in the presentation as I go forward. Next slide. Thank you. So before I get into individual programs that are included in the IIJA, I wanted to emphasize a couple of points, because you are a planning organization and because I actually have a master's degree in urban and regional planning. I actually am really interested in planning. So I was very focused on, particularly on behalf of NATO, who is a client of mine, on what happened in the IIJA for planning funds. And the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which is a broad program within the reauthorization bill, grew to $72 billion. And because metropolitan planning activities are takedown out of the STBG program, and they take 30% of whatever STBG is, the metropolitan planning funding for planning grew significantly to $2.28 billion over the life of the IIJA. And so whenever you see figures like 2.28 billion, you can just kind of divide those by 5, because it's going to be split out over and distributed to states, and then passed on to MPOs in kind of 1/5 increments. One of the areas that was interesting within the language relating to planning was that it created a new population category of 50,000 to, was it 100? Yeah, 200,000. And the reason for that was because a lot of the MPO planning activities really focused on the larger metropolitan areas over 200,000. And so suballocated funds were not reaching down to the smaller communities. Now, I'm not familiar enough with your local communities to know if 50,000 is still bigger than a majority of them. It probably is bigger than many of your local communities. And so I would also draw your attention to the fact that RTPOs, Rural Transportation Planning Organizations, get some love in this bill, and there's new language that requires consultation with RTPOs by the state DOTs. Now, I recognize that just because language is in a federal statute, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to just start deciding how some of these funds are spent. It does clarify that you have a seat at the table, but whether or not your state DOT pays attention to you at the end of the table is, another political issue. But do know that there is legislative language now in the IIJA that gives more standing to RTPOs and to rural transportation planning. Next slide, please. So just to give a few examples of individual programs that also specifically mention RTPOs, there is a new pilot program called Transportation Access, and it's a planning related program, and it specifically identifies regional transportation planning organizations as eligible participants in the program. There is a new $2 billion program for rural service transportation grants, and this is particularly important for your communities because it specifically includes regional transportation planning organizations as eligible applicants for that $2 billion in funding. And this is where I'll get into this a little bit more as we go on. Excuse me. The rural transportation, excuse me. The rural transportation grant program is not one of those programs that's just divided by 5. It starts off at a couple $100 million and then ramps up from there over the 5 years. And I have some further detail on that. There's a new program that's a really big program, $6.4 billion, a carbon reduction program. And that program also specifically mentions regional transportation and rural transportation as eligible activities. And it says that the law says that the states must suballocate 65% of the funds apportioned to this program on a per capita basis, and relates back to the STBG program. So those are examples of where your standing as a rural transportation body or planning organization is in fact, it will make a difference in both your eligibility and in your ability to have real serious conversations with state DOTs as they pass some of these funds around. Next slide, please. One of the disappointing but real results from the IIJA is that while it creates well over $100 billion in new discretionary grant programs that US DOT is going to administer, that's exciting. That's fabulous. It's we're in the salad days here, more money than we've ever seen in discretionary grant programs. That's the good news. The bad news is that almost all of it requires matching funds, and your local budgets probably have not grown, and so your ability to go ahead, while you've got a seat at the table, you've got eligibility, you can go ahead and apply for these funds. They still need to be matched. So even though that there are lots of federal funds that are going to be available, that is still a hurdle that rural, in particular, communities are going to struggle with, because there are two issues really that I hear a lot about from my clients. One is the inability to come up with the match funding, and some of the programs do have flexibility in the match and give the Secretary of Transportation flexibility to waive some of the match or to reduce match from a 80-20 to say a 90-10 ratio. But the other issue is kind of just capacity to apply for these funds, because I would imagine most of your organizations don't have grant writers just sitting around waiting to do something. And so it's tough to have the ability to put together the grant applications, but there are a lot of new discretionary grant programs that I'm going to emphasize that you have to do the cost benefit analysis of whether or not it's going to be worth your organization's decision to go ahead and spend $20,000 or $30,000 on a consultant to put together a grant application if you don't actually know you're going to be successful in that grant application. It's a tough call, but one of the interesting things about it is that we've got more money at the federal discretionary grant level than we've ever had before. So your chances of success are going to be greater than they've ever been before. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a whole variety of either new programs or existing programs that got significantly plussed up in the IIJA. And again, heavy text on all these slides. But when you look back at them, I tried to put together a real brief summary of the program name and then a brief description of the kinds of infrastructure that the programs are designed to fund and whether or not they have any maximum or minimum funding levels. So the RAISE program, which during the Trump administration was called the BIL program, and during the Obama administration was called the Tiger program. Now it's called the RAISE program, and it is really designed to fund smaller projects, generally under 25 million, that deal with local community infrastructure. And so this might include roads, bridges, public transit, passenger rail, surface transportation components, maybe even an airport related project, stormwater, those kinds of things. Bike ped, a lot of bike ped funding in the first round of RAISE that the Biden administration was particularly supportive of. There is a NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, on the street right now, which was issued in January, and the applications for RAISE grants are due April 14. And it was the NOFO that was sent out had $1.5 billion in available funding, and that's the biggest RAISE program that we've ever seen. And then last week, when Congress finally passed the FY22 omnibus spending bill, the appropriation bills, they actually plussed up the 1.5 billion that's available under this RAISE NOFO. They plussed it up another 775 million. So now we have 2.275 billion that's available in this round of RAISE, which is very encouraging because it means they're going to be able to fund a lot more projects than they have in previous rounds of RAISE. And I know I've worked with clients who have been successful in RAISE applications, and I've worked with clients that have been unsuccessful and are pretty discouraged. But I was actually talking with a contact of mine who works in the general counsel's office in USDOT, and he shared that if your project, if you were rejected in the last round of RAISE, and you did a debrief with USDOT, which you have every right to ask for, and they can tell you where your project application was strong and where it was weak. If it received a highly recommended in the last round but didn't get funded, it was probably just a lack of funding, not because the project was a weak project. And so this individual suggested to me that any project that received a highly recommended in the previous round that goes ahead and submits again is probably going to get funded in this round, given the overall size of the bill and size of the notice of funding opportunity. A second, or two more items on the RAISE that I want to emphasize. One is this new $775 million that was made available by Congress last week to plus up the RAISE, the current RAISE NOFO. It actually changed some of the parameters. And so under the existing NOFO for the 1.5 billion, it's a little confusing. Under the existing NOFO, 50% of the funds need to go to urban, 50% of the funds need to go to rural projects. Up to 5% of the funding can go for planning and design, engineering, things like that. And the maximum amount of grant funding is 25 million. Under the new 775 million, it's the same parameters, 50-50, 5%, but they changed the maximum grant amount up to 45 million. So if you have a small project, say a bridge project, that $25 million wasn't going to really solve your problem, but 45 million could, you should go ahead. I would encourage you to go ahead, submit your application, because there is 775 million out of the 2.275 billion that's going to be available will be able to be spent in a way that goes up to a maximum of $45 million for a particular project. Moving on from the RAISE program, that's the biggest notice of funding opportunity that's on the street right now from USDOT. But the next big program that you're probably familiar with is called the Infra program, and that is for bigger transportation projects. And the department has not actually issued a NOFO yet on the Infra program, but it is expected any day now. And what's really interesting about that is that these are projects that are typically in the $50 to $100 million range. They can go higher, but that's usually the level that they've been funded. A lot of funding in the IIJA for the Infra program, it goes up to $8 billion. And so significantly more funding than ever before. But because the department recognizes two things: one, that it's pretty tough for local communities to keep applying over and over and over for all of these discretionary grants. So they are going to develop and are developing something called a One app. And think about your kids that went to college and how they had one application and they used that application and applied to 10 different colleges. That's what the direction that USDOT is going in. And so they're going to combine the Infra program. And if you can go to the next slide, Sam. They're going to combine the Infra program and this projects of national significance, one on the bottom of this slide, which is kind of the mega projects. So these are the really big projects, the $500 million projects. And they're also going to go, if you go to the next slide, they're combining the Rural Transportation Grant Program. So this is this new program, Rural Transportation Grants. And so they're putting rural, mega, and infra all together in one NOFO, and it's going to come out in the next several weeks. And you're going to be able to make one application. And then I'm not entirely clear how USDOT is going to evaluate that, but it could be that they kind of take a little of from this program and a little from that program and put together a grant award for a project that actually has a little bit from each of those programs, depending on the size of the project and kind of the focus of it. So it's a new way that they're moving forward, and it's encouraging to me because it's going to be an easier application process for rural, for any community, but particularly for rural communities which have so much capacity constraint. And it's also going to be better for USDOT because frankly, they don't have the staff to go through all of these individual grant programs over and over and over. If you go back one slide, Sam, I just wanted to emphasize, so I talked a little bit about the mega projects, these projects of national significance. Those are probably not relevant to your, that program is probably not relevant to communities in your 5-county area, unless you have some massive bridge project that I'm not aware of. Reconnecting Communities, that's another new program. It's $1 billion program, but it was really focused on kind of knitting urban communities back together, communities that have been split by railroad projects or highways, urban projects that have split neighborhoods. I could conceivably see how that could, it could definitely apply to rural America. But my guess is that the administration is going to use that more as an urban focused program. Moving on to the next slide, Sam. So we talked a little bit about the Rural Transportation Grant Program. The PROTECT program is another new program, and this is a pretty substantial program, 1.4 billion. And it is very focused on climate-related impacts and flooding, and trying to make your infrastructure more resilient to withstand significant climate events. That program, because it is so new, I do not anticipate that the administration is going to have that program up and running and a notice of funding opportunity until at least this fall. I think they're moving forward pretty aggressively on rural transportation, but I think the Protect program is going to be down at least to the third quarter of this year before we see a NOFO on that. We are going to see a NOFO probably the second quarter of this year on the Safe Streets for All program. And this is a significant program. It's $5 billion. And it's very focused on trying to reduce fatalities, particularly as they relate to pedestrians and bicyclists, because pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities have really climbed, particularly during COVID days. And so the administration's going to put in, and Congress put in, a $5 billion program for Safe Streets for All. And I think that this could be particularly relevant to small rural communities, because you've got great main streets and great local communities that probably could use some increased pedestrian sidewalks, maybe shoulders, things like that aren't necessarily to the level that we'd all want them to be. And so this will be a really good source of funding for you all to focus on when that comes out. And again, I think that'll probably be the second quarter of this year. Moving on to the next slide. The two programs here that I wanted to emphasize on this slide. One is the Bridge Discretionary Grant Program. And so the IIJA put a significant amount of new funding into Bridge. Much of that funding is discretionary, and a significant portion is formula driven. So the formula funds will go straight to your state DOTs, and the state DOTs have to, in fact, sub-allocate a small portion of that for off-system bridges. But there's also going to be a new Bridge Discretionary Grant Program. US DOT has not announced that program yet, and I have not seen any projections on when they anticipate sending out a notice of funding opportunity for the new Bridge Discretionary Grant Program. But I would be surprised if they don't have it out by sometime this summer, because there's just so much need out there on Bridge Discretionary. Minimum grant size is $50 million for large projects, or $2.5 million for small projects. And so, that should fit a lot of small bridge projects related in rural areas. And one of the interesting things Sam was just mentioning to me, an interest in moving forward with another RAISE application. And I know I have a client in Oregon that has tried to get funding through the RAISE program in the past, and Tiger before that, or BIL, excuse me, for a rural bridge that's over 100 years old that really needs to be replaced, but it just doesn't have the traffic volumes that ever seem to get it into the priority categories that US DOT is looking for, although the need is really significant. But the rural area doesn't have the tax base really to support a complete redevelopment on its own. And one of the interesting things about this Bridge Discretionary Grant Program is, you see there on the right-hand side in the description, is that it requires the secretary to prioritize projects that have applied for but not yet received federal grants. And so that's encouraging to me, because I'm not sure under the RAISE program, this particular bridge that I'm thinking about is ever going to score high enough, just because of the traffic volumes. But if under the Bridge Discretionary Program, we can point the secretary to the fact that he has to prioritize projects that have previously been turned down, they're going to be a prime example, and you may have your own prime examples. Just at the bottom of this particular slide, airport terminal program, there's a notice of funding opportunity on the street right now. I think actually the deadline is the 28th, so or maybe it's the 23rd. So it's right around the corner, and it's for the first $1 billion out of that particular program. And they're very focused on rural terminals, particularly in small general aviation airports. So if you've got any GA airports in your communities, I would encourage them to take a look, although, as I said, we're in the last few days of that notice of funding opportunity. Next slide, please. Now, I did want to just emphasize, this is not a new program, the Transportation Alternatives Program, and you're all probably all pretty familiar with that. At one point, it was called it's called Transportation Alternatives now. It was called the Transportation Enhancements Program when it was first put together during the ICE-T days back in 1991 with the Intermodal Service Transportation Efficiency Act. And it is a 10% set aside out of the STBG program. And as I pointed out when we started, because the STBG program grew so significantly, so did the Transportation Alternatives Program. So it's a $7.2 billion program over the life of the IIJA, and transportation alternatives, every state does it a little bit different, but most states pass through and by law are required to pass through a significant portion of the Transportation Alternatives Program to the local MPO to decide how to program those funds. And those funds are typically, there's a variety of eligible activities. It's about 10 or 12. Everything from billboard control to historic preservation, but most communities spend a majority of their transportation alternatives on bicycle pedestrian facilities and trails, things like that. And so know that there should be significant new transportation alternative program funds available in your communities coming down from North Carolina DOT. And what's further interesting is that the funds can no longer be transferred out of the Transportation Alternatives Program unless the Secretary gives permission to do so. And many state DOTs just didn't like the program, didn't want to spend money on bike ped or any of those kinds of issues. And so they would say that they didn't have any eligible activities and they would transfer the money into other categories of spending. Congress has said you can't do that anymore. And now the TAP funds have to be spent on TAP activities. And that's significant and will provide a new opportunity for you all as you move forward. That I've already talked about the bridge set aside out of the STBG program. And so I think we can go on to the next slide. The NOFOs that are on the street right now, the RAISE program I talked a little bit about. FTA has a low and no emission grant program for mostly EV buses out on the street. Applications are due May 31st. And the FAA, as I said, has this airport terminal grant program that's on the street right now, but applications are due on March 28th. Next slide, please. You don't have to read any of this, and I'm not going to read any of this. What it shows is a whole bunch of notices of funding opportunity and their due dates. And when you get this information forwarded to you after this webinar, you can just click on the links that are hyperlinked into each one of these notices if you're at all interested in what the notice of funding opportunity is. And it shows the application due dates and it will take you right into the notice of funding opportunity. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend much time on the broadband issue, but I would assume that rural broadband is an issue that your 5 county areas are probably concerned about and interested in. There's $65 billion in the IIJA for rural broadband. Most of that funding, 42 billion, 42.5 billion of that is going to go out by formula to the states, and then the states are going to make grants available to individual counties based on broadband maps that are being finalized by the FCC now, and new broadband maps are supposed to come out by this summer. There are also other smaller grant programs for the balance of that $65 billion, and they're going to be run by different agencies, FCC, USDA, and private activity bonds are also going to be available in case your local community wants to issue a private activity bond for expanding broadband in your community. But that's as much as I'm going to say about that today. I'm not a broadband expert. If you go on the NTIA website, they've got a lot of really great information about the broadband funding and the way it's going to flow, and I would encourage you to do that. The $27.65 billion for grid infrastructure is really focused on the electrical grid and resiliency of that electrical grid. And then there's $55 billion for drinking water, wastewater, and lead service line replacement, things like that. Most of that funding is going to flow through your state revolving fund for water and wastewater infrastructure. So that's the contact that I would really focus on, is making sure that your relationships with your state revolving loan fund program officers is strong, so that you know when those funds are going to become available. Next slide, please. More detail on the broadband, but we can skip this one. Water resiliency programs, as I said, state drinking water revolving loan fund and the clean water revolving loan fund, some small amount of funding for brownfields. Notice, because there's so much money in the IIJA, that when you get down to 1.5 billion, that's considered a small program, which is kind of crazy, but that's the way these numbers work. And there's funding for FEMA and the BRIC program, funding for the Bureau of Reclamation for dams and canals, some funding for Army Corps of Engineers in the IIJA program, but most of that is going to be programmed through the Water Resources Development Act, which Congress is rewriting this summer. So just a little bit of detail on those. And I think we've got maybe one more slide, and that's probably it. These are some resources that I would encourage you to link or click on these links when you get the presentation sent to you. The third one down is the NACO overview of the IIJA. It was put together probably 3 or 4 weeks after the IIJA was passed. So it's a pretty good summary, but it is getting a little dated now, and there is more detail that has become available, but it's still a very useful summary. And because NACO is skewed towards rural America, it has kind of a rural focus to it. The second item there, or the second resource, is the White House fact sheets. And I thought it was a bit of a joke when I first started looking at them, because it's a summary of the IIJA, and the summary is about 487 pages long. And I was like, what? How can you have a summary that's 487 pages long? But in fact, it's really well organized, and it has 1 or 2 page summary of each individual program in the IIJA. And the way they put together this White House fact sheet document is by infrastructure category. So if you're interested in energy projects or water projects or transit projects or highway projects or bridge projects, all the programs that are relevant to that particular infrastructure issue are listed. And so it's actually a pretty good resource to have bookmarked in your computer, because you'll find that you go back to it a number of times. Some of those other resources there, and the bill text, and it's pretty hard to read bill text, but sometimes you want to go back and just double check on a bill text on eligibility issues. And then I've referenced a few other national associations like NARC, the National Association of Regional Councils, and ASHTO, and their summaries. But out of this page, I think the NACO and the White House fact sheets are the two that I would find most useful. Although USDOT does have state by state overviews. And so if you click on that link, you can find out exactly what the funding level is in North Carolina for each of these categories of funding. And you can see what, how much your state DOT is going to receive each year in the 5 years of the IJA, notwithstanding any additional appropriations that Congress may add, like they did with the $775 million that they added to the RAISE program. And that's it. So I appreciate you taking the time to hear me drone on for a while, and happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Hal, for your presentation. Let me see in our Q&A. Okay, could you speak more about project bundling? Since we have many projects that are under 10 million, do you think bundling projects as a 5-county region could improve our chances to receive funding?
The rural program, the new rural program specifically encourages the idea of bundling projects. And I think it will increase your chances of success because it'll show broad community support and a regional approach to your transportation investments. So I like, it's a great question. I was very happy to see in the eligibility for the rural program an encouragement to bundle projects. And I think it makes a lot of sense, particularly in rural America, where you've got projects that might be $2 or $3 million, but that can make a real significant impact in a small rural community. But you know, you hate to put together an application for such a small amount of money, but if you can bundle 4 or 5 of those projects and ask for 25 or 30 million, I think it's a good way to go. I would encourage it.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Again, you can use the question and answer feature on the webinar.
I would, well, people are thinking about whether they have any more questions. I have one more point that I wanted to make on RAISE, since the RAISE program is, the applications are due on April 14, and I know that some of you are thinking about putting together a RAISE application. I would encourage you to look at page 39, beginning on page 39 of the NOFO, because on page 39 of the NOFO, it's a section E of the NOFO, and section E outlines 8 different scoring criteria that the reviewers are going to review. And it is our understanding that in each category, the applicant will receive a score of high, medium, low, or non-responsive. And if you score high in 5 of the 8, you will probably get funded. And it can be any of the 5 of the 8, but if you score high in any of the 5 of the 8, and then just have something that is better than non-responsive in the other 3, because of the funding level in this round of funding, you're going to have a really good shot at getting funded. And so spend enough time in your application process to really think how you can answer those particular selection criteria the best you possibly can, because I think it's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've heard similar counsel or advice in our pursuit of reapplying. They lay it out very clearly this time around of each of the criteria breakdown.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they're just going to have, typically in past rounds, they've funded like 1 out of every 10 applications, but they're going to be able to fund a higher percentage this time, although they may get more applications than ever before because everyone's recognizing that there's more money available this round. So it's a little bit hard to predict, but what I've been hearing is that they're going to pay a lot of attention to those 8 scoring criteria. So, well, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. And if Summit Strategies can ever be helpful to any of you, you've got my contact information at the end of this webinar presentation, and I would encourage you to send me an email. I'm not very good at listening to my voicemail, so email is usually a better way to catch me. But I have a number of really talented colleagues here at Summit Strategies, and we love working with local government because it inspires us to help you reach some of these federal dollars.
All right. Well, thank you, Hal, for your time today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.